Yep. Testing 1, 2, 3. Did you guys hear that?
Yeah. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yay!
Did you guys hear that?
Okay.
We only ask that everybody who's here has their phone silenced. Copy of the book. Do you want it?
I do. Where did you want me to put it, or?
No, I'm just saying, I thought it was.
Yeah. All right. All right, I guess I will start. So welcome everyone. I'm incredibly excited. My name is Kortnei Morris, and I'm incredibly lucky because Demetrius asked me to come here to speak today about the Franklin and Armfield firm. If y'all don't know, the Franklin and Armfield firm was the largest domestic trafficker of enslaved laborers in the United States. So today I plan to start the presentation talking about a formerly enslaved man by the name of Michael G. Shiner, who had a run-in with the Franklin and Armfield firm. Then I'll talk a little bit about the firm, and then I'll end the presentation talking about the legacy that the firm left on the domestic slave trade, as well as institutions like the carceral system, institutions of higher education, as well as the hospitality industry. So let us get started. So Michael G. Shiner was born enslaved to a man named William Pumphrey in 1805 in Piscataway, Maryland. In 1813, Pumphrey sent Shiner to Washington, D.C. to work as a servant in his Grant Row Lodgings Hotel. 15 years later, Shiner was sold for $250. Approximately $7,000 today, by his enslaver to a man named Thomas Howard, who happened to be the chief clerk of the Washington Navy Yard. Howard leased Shiner out as a laborer to the Navy Yard paint shop, where Shiner ended up working for about 40 years. The same year that Howard purchased Shiner, Shiner actually married his first wife, a woman named Phyllis. Phyllis happened to be enslaved to a man named James Pumphrey. If the last name seems familiar, that is because they were brothers. James and William were brothers, and James happened to reside already in Washington, D.C. Together, Phyllis and Michael had 6 children. The Shiner family, we know, were regular attendees of the extant Ebenezer Methodist Church in Capitol Hill, which was founded in 1838. It is believed that Shiner used the First Presbyterian Church of Washington's adult classes to perfect his reading and writing, as the church had actually established a Sunday school for African Americans. So throughout his time in Washington, D.C., Shiner meticulously kept a journal. In the 50-plus years covered by Shiner, he provided first-hand narrative accounts of the War of 1812, the British invasion of Washington, D.C. in 1814, as well as the burning of the U.S. Capitol that very same year, the Snow Riot, which happened, I believe, 1835, as well as first-hand accounts of presidential inaugurations from John Quincy Adams to Lincoln's second inauguration. Shiner also chronicled day-to-day events like the average workday of a free or enslaved laborer in the Navy Yard, as well as the working conditions they had to contend with. Shiner wrote about unusual weather and celestial events. For example, 1816 was the year without a summer. He also described the solar eclipse of February 1831, the very same solar eclipse viewed by Nat Turner in Southampton County. Shiner describes fights he had gotten into as well. At one point, he threw his enslaver down the basement. He managed to avoid punishment by doing what he calls playing crazy. He spoke about the cholera epidemic as it ravaged Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1832. And interestingly enough, Shiner wrote about leading the charge to free his first wife and 3 of his children from slavery, which leads us to the topic that I'm discussing today, the Franklin and Armfield firm. So Shiner's enslaver, Thomas Howard, passed away in 1832. In his will, he stipulated that Michael Shiner be freed by 1836 as long as he, quote, conducted himself worthy of such a privilege. The next year, in 1833, Phyllis's enslaver James Pumphrey passes away, resulting in some of his enslaved laborers being put on the market to resolve some of his outstanding estate debts. Unfortunately, some of those laborers would include Phyllis, Michael Shiner's wife, and 3 of his daughters. Their names, Anne, Marianne, and Harriet. His wife and daughters, unfortunately, would be taken to the offices of Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trafficking firm in the United States, whose headquarters at the time were located in Alexandria, Virginia. So what you see here on this slide is page 52 of Michael Shiner's diary in the year 1833. On this page, towards the very bottom, Shiner recollects the effort that he put into freeing his wife and his daughters from the clutches of slavery. On this page, Shiner wrote, "The 5th day of June, 1833 on Wednesday, my wife and children, Phyllis Shiner, were sold to a couple of gentlemen, Mr. Franklin and Mr. John Armfield, and were carried down to Alexandria on the 6th day of June, 1833. On Thursday, the 7th day of June, 1833, I went to Alexandria 3 times in one day. Over the long bridge, and I were in great distress, but nevertheless, with the assistance of God, I got my wife and my children clear." A few days later, in this same journal, Shiner wrote the following, quote, "I am under 10,000 obligation to the Honorable Major General Hamlin for his kindness to me and my wife and my children on the 7th day of June, 1833. On Friday, the General laid a detachment on my wife and 3 children at Mr. Armfield Jail, and take in them from there and put them in the county jail of Alexandria to wait action of the court. My wife and children remained in county jail in Alexandria from the 7th of June, 1833, until the 11th of June, 1833. On Tuesday, and the same day, Mr. Levi Pumphrey executed papers and manumitted them free. The papers were executed at the City Hall in Washington. So after days of his family being detained in this dreadful slave pen, and then spending days in the local county jail, Shiner was able to free his wife and 3 small girls. While Shiner cites divine forces at play, it appears those forces were very mortal. Not only did Shiner have the support of some of the men that he worked with on the Navy Yard, he was able to secure Frances Scott Key as his wife's attorney. Yes, that Frances Scott Key, who's the attorney, author, and the poet who gave America the Star-Spangled Banner. Key filed a petition for freedom in the District of Columbia Circuit Court. The case of Phyllis Shiner, Ann Shiner, Harriet Shiner, and Marianne Shiner versus Levi Pumphrey. Frances Scott Key at the time of filing was the district attorney for the District of Columbia. Interestingly enough, Key was still the district attorney just 2 years later in 1835 when he decided to prosecute an abolitionist by the name of Reuben Crandall for distributing abolitionist materials in the city. This choice to prosecute would add tinder to the chaos that eventually erupted into the Snow Riot in 1835. So now let's talk about the firm. Franklin and Armfield was started in 1828 by 2 men named Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. The company experienced meteoric success, leading to both Franklin and Armfield to becoming the undisputed tycoons of the domestic slave trade. In its heyday, Franklin and Armfield was the largest slave trafficking firm in the country. It serviced much of the United States, with offices in Maryland, Virginia, Louisiana, as well as Mississippi. The company speculated on a massive scale, reportedly having $250,000, over $7 million today, in bills receivable after the 1831 and 1832 season alone. The following season, they sold over $100,000 worth of enslaved laborers, almost $3 million today. It is estimated in 1832, 5% of all commercial credit available through the Second Bank of the United States, located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was extended to the Franklin and Armfield firm. The decade of the 1830s and the Franklin and Armfield firm refined the process of domestic slave trading on large scale, making it more organized and indeed more ubiquitous. So in the early 1800s, the domestic slave trade became a major player in the Southern market economy. This happened for a couple of reasons, at least 2 of which are the cotton boom of the early 1800s, which was assisted in part by the War of 1812, as well as the prohibition of the importation of slaves into the United States. So let's go over first the cotton boom. So in the early 1800s, cotton eclipsed the traditional colonial crops of rice, tobacco, indigo, and sugar to become the premier cash crop. Part of the reason for this boom would be Eli Whitney's invention, the cotton gin. According to historian Sharon Ann Murphy, quote, "The invention and rapid spread of the cotton gin after 1793 made possible large-scale production of cotton, while increasing demand from the British textile industry rendered this production highly profitable. The first boom in cotton prices during the late 1810s stimulated new settlement among white planters specifically in the areas best suited for the growth of the crop. This would be the lower South states of South Carolina, Georgia, and the territories that would become Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, as well as eastern Texas. These agricultural and demographic changes in the South resulted in the upper South states, Maryland, Virginia, and our Carolinas, reconfiguring their economic strategy. With a decline in profits for colonial cash crops, the Upper South chose to start selling excess enslaved laborers The demographic changes across the South were so profound that, according to Robert Fogel, over 700,000 slaves of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas were sold to the Lower South between 1790 and 1860, reducing the potential slave population of the former states by 60%. According to historian Maury McInnes, the state of Virginia was the largest source of deportation from the Upper South to the Mid-South. 450,000 people were funneled out of Virginia and sent further south between 1810 and 1860, totaling $440 million today. This cotton boom was heightened by the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a conflict between the United States and Great Britain and their respective indigenous allies. The culmination of this war resulted in an increase of cotton production, which led to a textile boom in New England. 75% of the cotton grown in the American South was exported, while the remaining 25% was shipped to northern industrialists. Northern textile manufacturers then took the southern cotton and produced clothing made out of Negro cloth, a coarse and cheap cotton which they sold back to plantation owners to outfit their enslaved laborers. The majority of Negro cloth was produced in the North, specifically in textile mills in Rhode Island. So the other thing that caused the domestic slave trade to boom was the ban on the international slave trade. On March 2nd, 1807, the act to prohibit the importation of slaves was passed. It officially went into effect January 1st, 1808. This act granted enslavers 9 months to close down any international slave trade operations. It strengthened the domestic slave trade by incentivizing enslavers and traders to breed their enslaved laborers and then sell or rent any surplus labor. Prior to the 1800s, the domestic slave trade was pretty sporadic. It was individualistic and highly localized. Small-time traffickers known as speculators who traveled town to town. Did I miss something? No, okay. Small-time traffickers, also known as speculators, often traveled town to town purchasing enslaved laborers. They stored these individuals that they purchased in local jails or hotels or slave pens, which served as holding facilities until traffickers amassed enough stock to sell. This was prevalent in most southern cities, particularly Natchez, Mississippi. Natchez became one of the most important slave markets in the United States in the early 1800s, and this was due in part to organized firms popping up like the Franklin and Armfield firm. The main mode of transportation for most speculators was the coffle system. And a coffle system, or a coffle, is defined as a line of animals or enslaved laborers fastened or driven along together. The coffle system was actually the mode of transportation that Franklin and Armfield used in their earliest years. John Armfield was responsible for escorting his coffle to Natchez, Mississippi, once a year, particularly in the late summer. So, should a healthy man embark on this trek alone, it might take him 22 days. But if we consider this trip is being taken with 30 to 40 enslaved captives in tow, of varying physical dispositions, and wagons of other supplies, the trip could easily take a minimum of 49 to 56 days. In the earliest years of Franklin and Armfield, a traveler named Ethan Andrews passed by one of their coffles. He described seeing the coffle this way. Quote, 4 or 5 tents were spread, and the large wagons which were to accompany the expedition were stationed where they could be piled high with provisions and other necessaries. New clothes were loaded in bundles. Each Negro was furnished with 2 entire suits from the shop, Andrews noted, which he does not wear upon the road. Instead, these clothes were saved for the end of the trip, so each slave could dress well for sale. there were a pair of carriages for the whites. So if Armfield or James Franklin, Isaac Franklin's nephew, needed to escort captives down farther, let's say New Orleans, that added an additional 1,000 miles to the trek. Another option to transport coffles into the Deep South was to march them to Western Virginia, specifically Wheeling, where they could be loaded onto boats and sent down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to Natchez or New Orleans. Captives were also purchased in Kentucky and Tennessee on the way to New Orleans. These migrations of coffles from the Chesapeake are sometimes referred to as the Slave Trail of Tears. So now I want to talk about what made the Franklin and Armfield firm so unique. First and foremost, it was the scale at which they operated. Some historians estimate that alone the firm sold more enslaved laborers than all other domestic slave traffickers in the United States combined. In 1833, Isaac Franklin estimated that he had been responsible for selling 1,000 enslaved laborers himself, not including the number sold by his partner John Armfield, not including those sold by the third in command Rice Ballard, or the numerous employees and purchasing agents recruited by the company. The men were able to do this in part by transforming the way shipments of enslaved laborers were transported. The firm was founded in 1828, and 1 year after their founding, they had enough capital to purchase a brig for the purposes of transporting their cargo via water as opposed to over land. While the cost of shipping captives via boat was more expensive on the front end, there were many long-term benefits. One, it reduced the risk of enslaved people escaping. Two, it lowered the costs of security and insurance. Three, it provided a predictable shipping schedule, certainly for the traffickers and their customers, but also for merchants interested in renting space on the empty vessels going back north. It reduced the time spent traveling, which often translated to quicker resale in many cases. And more importantly, it exponentially increased profits for our traffickers. So transporting enslaved laborers via ship also allowed them to transport a greater number of people at once. The average number of enslaved laborers on their ships was around 150. To boost their bottom line, they allocated less space per person on their ships than the transatlantic slave trade vessels did. Owning their own ships also allowed them to cut out the middleman and add additional revenue streams to their business. After depositing their enslaved cargo in New Orleans or even Natchez, the ships often returned with cargoes of molasses, sugar, whiskey, and cotton, which merchants paid top dollar for space on Franklin and Armfield ships. The journey started from the headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, down the Chesapeake River, into the Atlantic Ocean, across the Gulf of Mexico, where they docked at New Orleans before continuing on to Natchez via the Mississippi River. During their prime shipping season, which was between October and May, when the weather was the best, ships would leave Alexandria twice a month. Shipping via water also allowed them to better insure their human cargo. For example, one of their ships, the Comet, ended up veering off course in 1831. The Comet and its 164 enslaved captives ended up stranded in the Bahama Banks. They were rescued and sent to Nassau, where the British colonial governor decided to free them. Franklin and Armfield received money for their lost cargo from the Louisiana State Insurance Company and the Mississippi Marine and Fire Insurance Company. The insurance companies filed a claim against the government of Great Britain, and Britain settled in 1840, paying the firm $94,532.52, which is approximately $3 million today. Franklin and Armfield did so much business, they opened offices in several locations. There was a small office in Baltimore manned by James Purvis. John Armfield worked out of the Alexandria office located on Duke Street. Isaac Franklin mainly worked out of the Natchez office until moving to an office in New Orleans. While the Natchez office was the main sales office, additional Franklin and Armfield offices popped up in Louisiana in the cities of Vidalia as well as St. Francisville. Their offices contained slave pens, which allowed the firm to reduce long-term costs associated with storing their captives. The slave pen in the basement of the Alexandria office could hold up to 200 persons. An operation of this magnitude requires employees. Isaac hired his 18-year-old nephew, James Franklin, who mainly worked out of the Natchez office. His partner, John Armfield, eventually married Isaac Franklin's niece, effectively solidifying this enterprise as a family affair. Rice Ballard was added to the company in 1831. Ballard initially worked out of a depot in Richmond before transferring to the office in Natchez. The company hired agents, contracted with headhunters who purchased enslaved laborers and sent them to the Alexandria office where Armfield stored them, while he could arrange their transportation to New Orleans, where Franklin would sell them to customers. According to historian Edward Baptist, after Ballard's onboarding, the three partners were shipping as many as 1,000 people annually from Ballard's Richmond Depot to New Orleans. Ballard paid operatives to scour the interior counties of Virginia, Piedmont, inquiring at rundown shops, rundown tobacco plantations, and sheriff sales for surplus labor to ship south as well as west. So the traffickers placed ads in newspapers seeking enslaved laborers for purchase almost every single day that they were in operation. These advertisements explicitly requested seamstresses, nurses, valets, field hands, carpenters, cooks, houseboys, coachmen, etc. In order to make the enslaved laborers more appealing to buyers, the men force-fed their captives to fatten them up, dyed their graying hair, and rubbed wax into wounds to make their captives appear healthier. The firm sold enslaved laborers to purchasers who would pay in cash or notes, a promise to pay in the near future, or drafts. So it's important to note that the firm's business strategy was not novel. They just happened to do everything at a larger, grander scale. Prior to Franklin and Armfield coming on the scene, there was a very successful slave trafficker located in Baltimore by the name of Austin Woolfolk. Woolfolk got his start as a small-time trafficker, working out of local bars and taverns, and negotiating his deals as most traffickers did. After a few years in business, Woolfolk built a headquarters located on Pratt Street in Baltimore that included a holding facility for his captives. This was rare at the time, with most traffickers being transients and working out of local bars. Woolfolk's office lent an air of respectability and professionalism to his practice, and the attached slave pen meant he saved a lot of money storing his captives until he was ready to sell them. Woolfolk purchased between 230 to 460 enslaved people annually. And between 1819 and 1832, he sent more than 2,500 slaves out of the Chesapeake and into the lower South. Woolfolk is believed to be the first domestic trafficker to transport enslaved people via boat, renting space on merchant vessels, distributing his cargo in Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina. Woolfolk was incredibly successful, becoming infamous on the eastern shore of Maryland, as well as the larger Chesapeake area, not only for the amount of enslaved people that he famously trafficked Frederick Douglass's aunt, one of his aunts, but he also his volatile demeanor and unethical practices. Woolfolk frequently trafficked free black people or sold term slaves, people whose enslavers promised them freedom and then reneged as a form of punishment. In 1827, Woolfolk assaulted a white abolitionist named Benjamin Lundy, leaving him bedridden for days after Lundy criticized him publicly in a local Baltimore newspaper. So let's contrast how John Armfield chose to deal with pesky abolitionists who were critical of his profession. Armfield frequently used his Alexandria office to run public relation campaigns in favor of respectable slave trading. Abolitionists and curious onlookers were always invited into Alexandria office for refreshments, while Armfield extolled the virtues of the institution of slavery and promoted interstate trade. One day, an abolitionist by the name of Joshua Levitt entered the Alexandria office to confront Armfield about improperly selling 2 men on one of his company vessels. Instead of making a scene, Armfield admitted to making a mistake and had the men removed and freed. This, and likely the relinquishing of Shiner's family early in the presentation, was done in order to preserve the good reputation of the firm. The purpose of the dog and pony show at the Alexandria office was to show skeptics that the negative reputation heaped upon slave trafficking was unfair, and that abolitionists and slavery's detractors' ire was undeserved. Woolfolk would actually remain successful just up until the Franklin and Armfield firm expanded their operations into Baltimore. The opening of a Baltimore office in 1832 effectively drove Woolfolk out of business. The slave trafficking firms and individual speculators that Franklin and Armfield did not drive out of business quickly learned to work with the firm. Franklin and Armfield soon had agents in Richmond and Warrenton, both in Virginia, as well as Easton and Frederick, both in Maryland, which helped the company establish a monopoly in the mid-Atlantic region. Around 1835, less than a decade after opening the firm, with millions made between the 2 men, both men started thinking about retiring. The men sold the Alexandria office in 1836 to their third-in-command, Rice Ballard, just in time for the financial panic of 1837. They also sold their ships and their New Orleans office to traffickers J&N Dick. Isaac Franklin's other slave trading firm in Natchez, named Franklin, Ballard and Company, continued to operate until 1839. In the 1850s, Ballard sold the Alexandria compound to fellow traffickers William Birch and C.M. Price. Ballard accumulated massive amount of wealth, eventually retiring to Louisville, Kentucky, to live off of the profits of the 7 plantations that he himself amassed in the 1830s and 1840s. Ballard would come to own almost 1,000 enslaved laborers before his death. The Alexandria office served as a slave jail until May of 1861, when the U.S. Army occupied the building. The Union Army, with little renovation needed, converted it into a prison. And towards the mid-1860s, the slave pens in the Alexandria office were used to house African-American Union soldiers, as just across the street, the Louverture military hospital that serviced black soldiers and housed newly freed men and provided a schoolhouse for their children. So let's talk about the enslavers, or the proprietors, the founders of the Franklin and Armfield firm. Isaac Franklin was born 1787 to a wealthy pioneer family in Tennessee who themselves owned a significant number of enslaved laborers. Franklin's father acquired his land through his military service, protecting the American frontier settlements from indigenous people. Franklin started trafficking enslaved black people quite early in his career, around 1810, with his older brothers. The ban on the international slave trade occurred when he was in his late teens, leading to he and his brothers to start transporting small batches of enslaved people from Virginia to deeper southern states. Franklin ceased slave trafficking in 1812 when he was drafted into the War of 1812. After the war ended, however, he returned to slave trafficking, becoming a full-time speculator. Franklin did quite well on his own initially. One of the reasons he was so successful was that he broke into the trade around the time that the domestic slave trade became critical to the Southern economic development, sorry. As I mentioned prior, this was due in part to the federal ban on international trafficking of enslaved people in 1807, as well as a large migration of white settlers into the Old Southwest between 1810 and 1840. Fairly swiftly, Franklin became a millionaire, allowing him to retire from slave trafficking in 1835, less than a decade after the founding of the Franklin and Armfield firm. A few years after retiring, Franklin married. The full respectability that Franklin sought but could not buy due to his notoriety as a slave trafficker was remedied some with his marriage to Adelicia Hayes, the daughter of a prominent attorney and a Presbyterian minister. Franklin retired to 8,500 acres of land and 550 enslaved laborers split across 6 different Louisiana plantations. He also purchased tracts of land in Tennessee, one of which would become Fairview Plantation. This plantation was reportedly larger and more impressive than that of his neighbor, the 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. Franklin also bought land in Texas, which at the time was not part of the United States, shares in the Commercial Bank of Manchester, the Nashville and Gallatin Turnpike Company, as well as the Nashville Racecourse. After his retirement, Franklin went on to become a wealthy planter, producing grain and livestock, which he shipped to his Louisiana's plantations for processing. Franklin died in April of 1846 as one of the richest men in the South due to the money made from the domestic slave trade. At his time of death, Franklin owned 7 plantations, with Fairview being his favorite, located in Sumner County, Tennessee. His entire estates at death consisted of 10,600 acres of land, 636 enslaved laborers who themselves were valued at a little over $300,000, a little over $9 million today. Franklin's estate was valued at nearly $710,000 at his death, and when adjusted for inflation, this is about $24 million. According to Joshua D. Rothman, adjusted relative to the distribution of wealth in the country at the time, Isaac Franklin died possessing the modern equivalent of more than $435 million. Now, John Armfield was born 1797 to a Quaker family of North Carolinian origins. He loathed the idea of becoming a planter, thus rejected that profession, but decided to try his hand at slave trafficking. His first transaction was a sale recorded in Natchez, Mississippi in 1819. He soon found a job as a stagecoach driver and would do that until Isaac Franklin onboarded him in 1824, appointing him as his assistant. Within 4 years, the two men started their own firm, operating initially out of the Alexandria office, with Armfield being promoted to junior partner. As junior partner, he was responsible for the buying and shipping enslaved people to Natchez, Mississippi, where Franklin could sell them. In 1831, at the age of 34, Armfield marries Isaac Franklin's niece, Martha Franklin, and that same year would mark the year that he officially became a millionaire off of the trafficking of black people. By the time the two men left Franklin and Armfield in 1835, Armfield had a 339-acre plantation in Tennessee with a 2-story brick home on it to settle down on that he called hard times. Still resistant to the idea of becoming a planter, Armfield chose to try his hand at being a cotton broker. The wealth from the slave trafficking and his new gig as a cotton broker allowed him to provide his sister's children with their own plantation to call their home. Complete with 360 acres of land, 5 enslaved laborers, a wagon, cattle, hogs, and sheep, and a complete set of farming utensils. By 1850, he made significant changes to his own 339-acre plantation, improving over 300 acres of it. 9 years later, he purchased a Pittman tract for about $12,000, around $417,000 today. For this, he received the land, the livestock on the land, the household's furniture, the silver in the home, as well as its 9 enslaved laborers that were attached to it. The enslaved laborers consisted of 6 men and 3 women between the ages of 16 and 21. His partner in trafficking, Franklin, died before the onset of the Civil War, but Armfield would not be quite as lucky. As the Civil War started, Armfield made his allegiances clear, throwing his support behind the Confederate Army. Armfield hosted barbecues at his property to help the Confederate Army find volunteers for enlistment. As a thank you, he received honorary rank of general from the county's residents and received effusive praise in the local newspaper. These good times did not last long, however. Just 1 year into the Civil War, Armfield began to deal with failing physical health and severe mental deterioration. After his nephew, a Confederate soldier, was killed at the Battle of Shiloh, his paranoia kicked into overdrive, effectively running his wife away from the home and causing him to amend his will, writing out the children of Franklin's extended family, whom he began caring for after his partner's death. Convinced that the war would financially ruin him, he scrambled to take his money out of banks and instructed his accountant to hide his banknotes, gold, and silver in tree stumps and hidey holes. His accountant estimates that he hid about $500,000 in money for Armfield. Armfield was right about the war bankrupting him. After the Civil War ended, Armfield made his way back to New Orleans to attempt to retrieve additional money out of his bank accounts. The war left him debt-ridden, relative to the riches he had accumulated pre-war. According to the 1870 Grundy County Census, Armfield had but $5,000 in real estate and a personal estate valued at $30,000, much of which was in cash deposited with the Third National Bank of Nashville. Prior to his death, Armfield filed a claim with the Secretary of War, requesting restitution for the money taken out of his Louisiana bank accounts by the Union Army. It would be denied in 1868. Armfield died in 1871, leaving an estate worth $57,000 in cash and government bonds, with $104,000 in debt. When he passed, local newspapers eulogized him as, quote, the warm and steadfast friend of all improvements, of every description, and the earnest and enthusiastic friend of the widow and orphan, as a philanthropist and a benefactor, who was a friend of virtue, an advocate of morality, and a supporter of Christianity. Armfield's brother-in-law, John W. Franklin, revived Armfield's restitution claim in 1884, this time taking it directly to Congress. John Armfield lied on the initial application, stating that during the war he was an old, infirm man who sat quietly at home. On the legal form, he stated that he gave no aid, comfort, or encouragement to the rebellion or to persons engaged therein, but throughout the war remained loyal to the government of the United States. John W. Franklin repeated this lie in 1884, resulting in a ruling in Armfield's favor. In January of 1885, Congress requested that the Secretary of the Treasury turn over $18,000 in federal funds to Franklin on behalf of Armfield's widow, Martha. That is approximately $626,000 today. So we can see that both men left the business extraordinarily wealthy. Unfortunately, the legacy of Franklin and Armfield was not confined to their personal aggrandizement. The men's legacies extended to the domestic trafficking at large in the United States, the carceral system, higher education, as well as hospitality. So now we're going to explore their legacies in those arenas. In 1850, well after the retirement of both men, slave traffickers improved upon the practices of Franklin and Armfield and their predecessor Woolfolk, transporting over 250,000 enslaved people across state lines, a 35% increase from their numbers in the 1840s. 3/4 of that number still consisted of enslaved people being funneled out of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. But the 1850s also saw dramatic increases of persons traded out of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia as well. Many of these individuals ended up in Texas, as 150,000 were taken to Texas in 1850s alone. The tangible legacies that both men left lasted far longer than their innovation to the domestic slave trade industry, which collapsed in 1865. With enormous amounts of wealth bequeathed to her from her husband, Adelicia Franklin built an ornate summer home, which she called Belmont, in Nashville, Tennessee. In the late 1880s, she sold this plantation to 2 women school teachers who would go on to found Belmont Women's College. Today, that school exists as Belmont University. John Armfield was also responsible for the founding of a university that exists to this very day. Armfield was a founder, the largest donor, and an appointed school board trustee for the University of the South, located in Sewanee, Tennessee. The University of the South was created to address fervent concerns about the rising tide of Northern abolitionism. A close friend of Armfield's, Leonidas Polk, wanted to create a university that was geared towards educating Southern white men to enter the Episcopal clergy, minus any, quote, dangerous and destabilizing anti-slavery influences. Polk and other founding members relied on Armfield to raise funds for the creation of the school. Armfield provided some of the funding for the creation of the school, and he tapped Adelicia Franklin to contribute as well. In addition to providing funding, he identified the location for the new school and would be there to sign its Declaration of Principles, which contained the school's institutional governance and capital campaign plans. After Armfield accepted appointment to the school's board of trustees, he also began to host the school's board meetings. The University of the South would not be the only institution built by Armfield that exists to this day. Using funds acquired as an assistant and then a junior partner at Franklin and Armfield, Armfield established a resort in Beersheba Springs in Grundy County, Tennessee. Beersheba was located 100 miles southeast of Nashville, Tennessee, and provided a place for white Southerners to escape summer heat and take advantage of local mineral spring water. The resort consisted of a hotel and 20 private cottages that remained popular up until the coming of the Civil War. To staff this luxury resort, he imported chefs and musicians from New Orleans. Opening a resort or hotel was not that big of a leap from slave trafficking as it would appear to be. According to Joshua D. Rothman, quote, running hotels was often not so much abandoning the slave trade as it was working adjacent to it. After all, another prominent slave trader, Calvin Rutherford, left slave trading and founded the National Hotel in 1855, which would be located in Washington, D.C. The National Hotel would be described as one of the finest hotels in the world shortly after it opened. It also had an auction block inside the building, auction block outside the building, and commission houses across the street that promised to dispose of all kinds of property, that property being enslaved people. Rothman also goes on to state that slave trading and hotel keeping were also associated occupations because they entailed satisfying the demands of wealthy white people, which made John Armfield's progression from the former to the latter entirely understandable. His resort, Beersheba Springs, was modeled after the hot baths in Virginia where wealthy Americans vacationed. The main resort building had 150 exquisitely furnished guest rooms. The resort also had 20 freestanding cottages that were rented out by guests if they wanted additional privacy. The cottages were built to the specifications of their inhabitants, who paid for the construction costs for the cottages as well as its rent annually. Cottage dwellers included the likes of John M. Bass, attorney and bank president and former mayor of Nashville, with plantations in both Louisiana and Arkansas, as well as prominent Nashville doctors Thomas Harding and John Winters, as well as the creme de la creme of the prominent Southern planters and slaveholders. Two of the cottages were occupied by Episcopal bishops Leonidas Polk and James Otey, and Otey happens to be the first Episcopal bishop of Tennessee. In 1855, Armfield renovated Beersheba Springs using enslaved laborers to build a sawmill, a grist mill, and a kiln. Guests also had access to a post office, a barber shop, dry goods shop, and tobacco stores, a bathhouse, as well as an ice house. During the Civil War, Armfield hunkered down at his resort, paying an armed sentinel to guard his cottage. The resort wouldn't remain untouched for long, as in July of 1863, Union troops ransacked the resort. According to witnesses, quote, they rode horses through the hotel gallery, pulled chandeliers in the dining room, and cut the cloth off the billiard tables. They set up wine bottles like pins and knocked them over with bowling balls. They pillaged most of the cottages, grabbing armfuls of fancy dresses, taking rugs, curtains, and books, and hauling away its furniture. When the Union troops came through, some of the enslaved laborers left with the Union troops. A woman named Letha and her 8 children were freed by her own husband, who joined the Union Army 1 year prior. It is reported that upon Letha and her children leaving, Martha, Armfield's wife, quote, thanked a Union officer for having afforded them an opportunity to leave, saying that many of the children were small and of no profit to us, only a dead expense, and it is a happy riddance. John Armfield swore allegiance to the United States government only 1 day after the Union troops raided his resort. Beersheba Springs is still in use today. The Methodist Church purchased it in 1940. It is now used as an event space and is frequently used to host Methodist retreats. So remember when I mentioned Franklin had several plantations in Louisiana? Let's return to that. Franklin had a massive amount of land divided into plantations: Angola, Panola, Loango, Bellevue, Killarney, Lac Lamond, and Monrovia. Angola and Loango were named after regions in Africa that Europeans pillaged enslaved African laborers from. And Panola is the Choctaw word for cotton, a staple crop that many of Franklin's plantations produced. These plantations were combined and sold by Franklin's widow in 1880 to Louis Traeger and Samuel L. James, who happened to be a former Confederate Army officer, for $100,000. James at the time was a civil engineer and a levee contractor for the firm James, Buckner and Company. He also had a lease to manage the prison system in Louisiana. This 21-year lease allowed him and his company to manage a prison in Baton Rouge known as the Walls, as well as to lease out convicts who would work on private plantations as well as public works projects. Management under James was described as, quote, the most cynical, profit-oriented, and brutal prison regime in Louisiana history. Approximately 3,000 prisoners died under James's lease between 1870 and 1901. In 1901, James sold Angola, Bellevue, Loango, Killarney plantations to the state of Louisiana, who would immediately start operating a state-run penitentiary on the lands. Sorry, y'all. Too many papers. Essentially, that penitentiary is Angola Penitentiary, Louisiana State Penitentiary. Let me see if I can find. The perils of having such a long presentation. So I guess I'll just finish it up. So if you're wondering what happened to the offices of Franklin and Armfield Firm, most of them are gone today, but one still exists. The one that still exists is the headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. That is now the Freedom House Museum, which I encourage everyone to visit if you're ever in Alexandria. It's on Duke Street. So it is a multi-story museum. Only the first floor and only part of the first floor is actually dedicated to the Franklin and Armfield, the history of the firm. And most of that dedication is actually to the men, women, and children who were trafficked through the firm. The rest of the museum is dedicated to Union troops and prominent Black Virginians, Northern Black Virginians who made history in the area. And so that culminates the presentation. So if there are any questions?
Certainly the presentation for me leads to lots of questions which I can't form just yet. But inspires moving to other works, other scholarship, and think about connections in some of the names, and some of the activities you spoke of. One being that comes to mind is that it's either the Virginia Museum of History and Culture did a presentation in the last couple of years about based on the portrait of these pretty girls and fancy girls, which is for me a whole another notion of study to find out how they certainly came to be. I have my own thoughts on how it came to be, and essentially no, but young Black women generally created by slave-holding white men with Black women, and set aside from more darker folk to be lighter and attractive to men, and concubinage and all of that. Just, we live in an insidious world, but it's the world we're in. The other would be to note, is there any relation with this business and the slave trading businesses in Richmond?
There's,
I'm sure to repeat the question.
Oh, okay. So I guess I'll tackle the very first question regarding fancy girls. So much of the presentation, not all of it, is based on this book, The Ledger and the Chain, How the Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America by Joshua D. Rothman. In this book, I didn't include it in the presentation because I didn't know the age groups of the people who may be listening or attending. But in the book, he actually talks about fancy girls. So we do know, I mentioned that every day that this firm was in business, just shy of 10 years, they did put out ads for enslaved laborers. And one of the things that they did request were fancy girls who acted as concubines. The men of Franklin and Armfield Firm, the executives, if you will, so Rice Ballard, Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, through their letters and correspondences, at a certain point did think about potentially opening up their own brothel, which they would staff with fancy girls who typically were multiracial, biracial, or fair, Black women, but with very fair complexions. And in the book by Joshua Rothman, he does, so We don't know. We don't have records that they actually opened this brothel, though it was amusing in their correspondences. But we do know that there were women who they would acquire, and instead of selling, they would use for themselves because they also put that in their correspondences. So there was one young lady that was sent between three of the men, right? So John Armfield, Isaac Franklin, and I believe Isaac Franklin's nephew, James Franklin. And they would just pass her from office to office as opposed to actually selling her to a customer. They did not sell her until she became pregnant, and so no longer of use to them. So the book does go over that. And actually, I quote it from a historian named Edward Baptist. He talks quite a bit about fancy girls and their use within the domestic slave trade as well, if you're interested in more information on that. And can you remind me of the last question? It was, do you remember?
Connections with Armfield and Franklin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Say that again?
Richmond connections.
Richmond, yes, yes, yes. So their third in command was a man named Rice Ballard. And so Rice Ballard actually manned the Richmond office. So Franklin and Armfield, I know you guys just came in. So Franklin and Armfield is essentially the most successful domestic slave trafficking firm in the United States. It was founded by two men by the name of Isaac Franklin and John Armfield in 1828. And they would operate it until about 18, what is it, like, for 9 to 10 years, essentially, before passing it off to their third command, who was Rice Ballard. And then Isaac Franklin also had another slave trafficking firm, but it was not nearly as lucrative as Franklin and Armfield. And so they had several offices, which is one of the reasons why they were so successful. Small-time traffickers, you had to find a hotel or a jail or somebody to store your stock, but because they had offices everywhere, they could essentially build slave pens. They don't have to pay a tavern owner or jailer to store their folks. They could store more people because it was their own places. So they ended up having offices in Baltimore, Maryland, in New Orleans, St. Francisville, in Vidalia, Louisiana, in Natchez, Mississippi, Richmond, Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia, with the headquarters being Duke Street, and I think I have most of them in Natchez, Mississippi. So Rice Ballard would be the Richmond connection to Franklin and Armfield. And then you also have to keep in mind that you had, you know, the executives, the main men at the top. But one of the ways that they snuffed out all smaller competition was by getting small-time traffickers to basically become headhunters for enslaved laborers for them. And so you certainly would have had a bunch of headhunters roaming around Richmond and its environs looking for laborers on behalf of the Franklin and Armfield firm.
How were these businesses, say Franklin and Armfield, regulated by the states, the governments? Were they required to pay taxes on the souls they held over the course of the year, or pay taxes on the receipts they earned?
So how were businesses like Franklin and Armfield regulated by the government, and do they have to pay taxes? I actually do not know that. I don't remember that actually being mentioned in the book, whether or not they had to pay taxes and how they paid taxes on their enslaved laborers. So that's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that one. Yeah.
And I asked because the state
Yeah.
exerts taxation on property.
Right. That I'm not sure. Someone who may have written about it might be Edward Baptist. I believe his books, is it Things Never... Let me try to look and see if I can find the title of his book. Because he goes in depth about the economics of the slave trade. The Half Has Never Been Told is the name of his book, and it's Edward Baptist. So Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. So that would be one place I would look, or even if you could find some of the smaller articles on like academic databases like JSTOR or something like that. He's been published widely on that. So I'm sorry I don't have. His name is Edward Baptist, and the name of the book is The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. It's a pretty big book. It's probably about the same size as this, but it's really good, pretty extensive, and focuses a lot on the financial aspects of the trade.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm
there-
formulating my question, so if you have another one, go ahead, Mr. Hughes.
Moments of silence. What led you to this area of scholarship and study of this particular area that you're talking with us about today?
I honestly think I love African American history. Generally, my preferences are Black colonial history, early republics or early 1800s. I think what ended up happening is I ended up reading another book about the Snow Riot, which is a race riot that happened in Washington, D.C., 1835. And in this book, a man named Michael Shiner was mentioned. You guys came in a little bit late, but I started this presentation off since it's Black History Month, and my grudge with the way Black history is told is it's often redundant. I find it lacking in detail. There's often insufficient context. So I started this presentation actually not with the firm and its owners, but with a Black man who had saved his wife and 3 girls from the firm. His wife's enslaver had died, and they needed to settle some debts, and so they took his wife and 3 of his 6 children and brought them to the firm to be sold. But despite being an enslaved Black man in Washington, D.C., he knew a few people, managed to get Francis Scott Key, the district attorney at the time, as his wife's attorney, and ended up getting his wife and his 3 little girls free. Because I think it's about, when we tell Black history, we often lose the agency of Black people. So Black people end up becoming objects. So it's something happened to them, something was given to them, but we don't necessarily understand the situations in which they were living, and we don't understand, we know that they've done things, but we don't know what's motivating them, right? And so that's how I started this presentation, with the story of Michael G. Shiner, which is his name. And so in this book called A Snowstorm in August, I can't remember the subtitle, but it's about the snow riot in Washington, D.C. in 1835. Michael Shiner was brought up, and it's just like a quick little sentence, Something happened, it's all really serendipitous, because I was on Twitter, ended up running into a military historian by the name of John G. Sharp. He had transcribed Michael Shiner's journal. So Michael Shiner kept a journal that he didn't tell people about. His son actually ended up publishing it once his father passed. 50 years. So this Black man kept a journal detailing 50 plus years of his life in Washington, D.C. He had seen a bunch, color epidemics, race riots. Michael Shiner actually talks about the snow riot. He talks about what it was like being an enslaved laborer on the Navy Yard, which is where Shiner was enslaved to, where he was working. He discusses freeing his daughter and his wife. And so I'm not sure how I found out about, I think I was listening to, I saw an interview with the author, because I listened to a lot of professors and author interviews. And so I got the book, and it was amazing because I've lived in Northern Virginia forever, middle school, elementary school, high school, and never knew about the Franklin and Armfield firm, despite living perhaps 15, 20-ish minutes away from where it was located, despite my father having taken me to Black history sites in Alexandria. And I was astonished about all of the ways that this one firm was connected to so many institutions, whether it's institutions of higher learning with 2 universities being founded out of money seeded by the Franklin and Armfield firm, thus slavery, whether it's in carceral system, right? So we talk a lot about the similarities between prison and jail and slavery, but often the connections aren't kind of distinctly made, right? And so this book did that for me, but also hospitality. I had no idea the role of taverns, hotels, kind of leisure sites, and their connection to the slave trade. So I guess that's what piqued my interest, and that's what led me to creating a presentation about it. I think we talk about slavery and its legacy in kind of nebulous ways, but far too often we don't make kind of the one-on-one correlation between how something became another thing. And since I've done this project or made this presentation, read this book, almost every story that I encounter reifies what's in this book, right? So 1858, you have the Oberlin-Wellington rescue. It's a rescue of a man named John Price who fled Kentucky, and he ends up in Oberlin, which had been an abolitionist kind of hotspot. His enslaver found out, had the sheriffs come and bring him back. And so they took him to Wellington, which is why it's called the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue. They took him a couple of towns up to Wellington, which was more friendly to the institution of slavery. But where they left him, where they had him in prison, was a hotel, right? And so it's like all of these stories kind of reifies the connections, whether it's universities, places of higher learning, whether it's hotels, taverns, or whether it's prisons, right? Alexis works with the White Hill Enslaved Labor Project, and I've been transcribing the journal of one of the enslavers. And we found out that, you want to tell the story, Alexis? There was a group of enslaved folks. That's true. The ones that, there was a group of enslaved folks, Charles Friend was the enslavers, who weren't happy being enslaved by him, and thus, you know, he brought them to the jail to sell, because the jail was not only where you went if you were being a miscreant or if you did something illegal, but it was also a place where enslaved people were stored and actively sold. And what's the name of the Cary Street Jail in Richmond?
Oh, well, that's a couple of stories that I think are mixed in.
Complete?
So-
Okay.
No. So for White Hill Plantation, that's located on the property of Petersburg National Battlefield, or if you're actually familiar with the city of Petersburg, Charles Friend lived in the building that was Wabi Sabi, or is Wabi Sabi, because it's not a was, because we're there too often. But is Wabi Sabi on the backside of Brickhouse Run, that would have been where the enslaved quarters were, as well as the kitchen. Across the street, once again, if you're familiar with the city of Petersburg, there is a building there that has been a barbershop multiple times, a black barbershop multiple times, it's been a dagger, it's been lots of things. That is actually a slave jail.
Yeah.
So if you go and you look outside of that building, you can still see that the windows have bars on the outside of them. Charles Friend, one of the things that I, as Kortnei was saying, kind of revel in is the idea that enslaved people had agency and that they did have voice, and that in many ways they used their body, they reoriented themselves in space for their own agency and freedom. And so in doing that, many of the enslaved people at White Hill rebelled and escaped and sought their own freedom. There are stories of several people, the one that I think Kortnei might be hinting at, that's why I said, which story? People were freeing themselves on a regular basis, is that Charles Friend held people responsible for the theft of some food, and so no one admitted to this crime for weeks on end. They were not happy about him then taking away their food for weeks. So you have 13 people, 12 men and 1 woman, who go and knock on his door one morning and say, "I'd like to be sold." I don't think that we often hear that people requesting, you need to sell me.
Right.
And that what it really means to be sold from a place when you have connections that are very deep. The only place you may have ever known, or maybe you've known many places, and those places have been different each time that you've moved. What it means for you to say with your own voice that I would like to leave the place that I'm in. We oftentimes interpret slavery in a way that is, you have no choice, and you are where you are. Charles Friend tells this group of people, sleep on it. Take a little rest tonight, sleep on it. If you feel the same way, come back. Those 12 or those 13 people come back the next day and say they'd like to be sold. And so I think as Kortnei talks about interconnectivity and the difference between some of these northern slave states and southern slave states is that Charles Friend then takes these 13 people down south to Alabama to sell. And I get that question a lot when people say, well, why don't you just sell them somewhere here? As during that time period with the plantations, the profitability is to sell them further south where they can be used on larger plantations in that way. But we don't hear those stories of people requesting and what that really means for them and to make a choice like that because that is a choice.
Yeah, so.
We had a question online that says, please explain the correlation between the name of the firm, Franklin and Armfield, and Armstrong. I don't know what that means.
Oh, I think that was an error. I saw that. So I apologize for that. That should have been Armfield where you saw the Armstrong.
Okay.
Yes, 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 yes,
So
yes,
that
yes.
answers that question.
Yes.
Spell check.
Spell check. Armstrong is a real word. So
It is. But I should have had someone else do it because when you look at your own stuff so many times, you see what you want to see. Yes, yeah.
Mistake is okay.
I think it is. I hope the information was so interesting that the mistake is a small piece of this. All right? So, yes.
You made reference, and I can't recall the context just right now, of, and you talk about Ebenezer Baptist Church. Something happened with Ebenezer. Can we?
So Phyllis and the kids went to they frequented Ebenezer Baptist Church, which still exists today in Washington, D.C. And Michael Shiner took Sunday school lesson, and he was an adult. And so this tells you Sunday school isn't just for children, which I think most people have an assumption about. He took Sunday school where they enforced reading and writing at First Presbyterian in Washington, D.C. And I can't remember if that still exists to this day. It may or may not. But Ebenezer certainly still does, which I think ties into the role of the church historically in terms of our liberation, but also providing us sources that we couldn't get elsewhere. So,
I have a question.
yeah.
You had spoken about during your presentation the repeated advertisements that they would put in newspapers, so every single day putting something there. Did you have any?
So I'll turn so you guys can see go ahead.
Did you look into some of those advertisements yourself? Was there anything interesting or different that you saw? So I'm familiar with these advertisements, but it seems like the prolificness of every single day.
So yes, they're lazy. They use the very same one and perhaps change the date. So the wording for the most part remained the same. And what would happen is they would change the date. And there were a few newspapers, but the National Intelligencer was one of the main newspapers that they used and advertised in. And it's funny because the National Intelligencer, if you were to go through the National Intelligencer, you'll see so many kind of interesting things. Not wonderful, but the interesting thing about the Snow Riot in 1835, which was a race riot, the first person to lose their business was a man who's originally from Virginia. It was a man named Beverly Snow. And in many ways, he's believed to be responsible for bringing restaurant culture to Washington, D.C. And so prior to his establishment, if you were to go into a restaurant, it was almost like a mess hall or a banquet. You just get what's there. You don't have your own private table. But Beverly, who had been formerly enslaved, he had been freed, but while he was enslaved in Virginia, he was permitted to operate an oyster house. And so he had interests in culinary arts, and particularly the finer ones. And so what he would open when he got to Washington, D.C. with his wife is what they would call a table d'hôte, which is a French-style restaurant which was known for having a prix-fixe menu, right? You pick what you want, refined meals for a refined palate. You can have your own table, and he was very interested in creating a beautiful ambiance, right? And so his restaurant was the very first restaurant to be destroyed in the snow riot of 1835. If you look in the the National Intelligencer, you'll find quite a bit of his advertisements for his restaurants, which was called, I want to say, the Epicurean Eating House, because he had enough money to advertise in the National Intelligencer as well as other DC newspapers. Another interesting thing, if you look in the National Intelligencer, and I cannot remember the year, but the land that is today the National Harbor used to be a plantation called Salubria, which was owned by a man named John Baines, I believe. I have to look that up. But in the 1830s, he had a 13 or 14-year-old enslaved little girl who was in charge of taking care of his children. And he had, at this point, 2 fairly young sons. Baines was also a doctor and a horticulturist. He did a bunch of things. But he unfortunately had arsenic in his office, which the young child named Judah ended up putting in the 2 boys' meals and killing them. And so when she was questioned, she said, yeah, I killed the boys, and I set the plantation on fire the other year, and I actually killed your daughter, who they didn't suspect had been murdered because there was a yellow fever epidemic. And so when Judah killed the babies, the advertisement or the article ended up in the National Intelligencer. Yeah, so if anyone wants to just go looking through old newspapers, I can guarantee you'll find some interesting things in the National Intelligencer.
Well, you raised something for me that's kind of a family affair.
Mm-hmm.
You noted that on the site of the National Harbor, a plantation. I have an uncle now, many years past, who owned a significant piece of land on Oxon Hill Road in Oxon Hill, Maryland, which is just up the rise from the National Harbor. And I will have to look to see if there's some connection. As the family story goes, he at one point was the driver for the, and this would have been, I guess, in the 1940s or 50s, maybe around that time. He was the driver for the president of Riggs National Bank, which was a prominent bank in D.C., just cat a corner from the White House. But for us as children, we would be sent to stay with Uncle Terry and Aunt May once in the summer on what for us was this enormous kind of farm or farmette. At the time, Uncle Terry had 25 or so acres, but this huge house. And for us, growing up in row houses, government housing, this was like heaven. It was, but I'm always intrigued by now what you notice this plantation at some point in time. A person named Bain.
Yeah, Bayne. And since we were talking about institutions of higher education and slavery, Bain had his hand in helping to kind of fund and found the University of Maryland College Park.
So that gives me some desire to look to see if some of this land was part of, because I know where Uncle Terry's property was, is now part of what is National Harbor. Something to look at.
Yes, so Salubria was a 42-acre plantation. So I don't know how far that would have been from the site of the spot that you're talking about. But if you do go to National Harbor, I haven't seen it myself in person, but there should be actually a plaque somewhere on the harbor that commemorates Judah. And I believe when they took over the land, some of the Bain family is still buried there. I think the 2 children that Judah killed are still buried there. So I think the cemetery is still there as well. If gambling and eating and riding the Ferris wheel and the fun parts of National Harbor are too dull.
We'll be here soon, so, that's a whole nother Petersburg history story.
Oh, but yes.
But also, you compel me now to kind of see a relationship with folk from Sewanee, and my hopefully continuing to be alma mater, St. Augustine's College, which is in the throes of killing itself.
In Raleigh?
Yes.
Okay.
It's subject to go the way of the dodo in a minute.
Oh, God.
That's a whole nother backstory, but it was, of course, established by the Episcopalian Church, mostly the Episcopalian Church of the South. And I'm wondering if some of these Sewanee folk had something to do with St. Aug, and its founding, as well as the 2 other schools, HBCUs, established by the Episcopalian Church, St. Aug, St. Paul, and Voorhees. Maybe some of these men you have directed my attention to may have something to do with it. I wish the Episcopalian Church would reach in and save us now.
I don't know if the Episcopalians of Sewanee would have an interest in establishing any kind of institution to educate Black people. So they may just share, the denomination. I don't know that there's a shared interest with that.
Well, kind of at the time, I think following the war, there was these notions you'll see in readings of Episcopalian Church South and Episcopalian Church North. So I would seem to agree a lot.
Right.
The Sewanee folk, not us.
Right, yeah.
So maybe some of them, you mentioned that some of them may have become a little more enlightened, or they had come to Jesus moment, or I doubt it.
I mean, maybe. I think that's certainly true of like the Quakers, right?
You mentioned one of these folks.
Well, yes. But at least in, the 1700s, the Quakers at a certain point, the Quakers were amenable to getting rid of their enslaved laborers. So an example would be Paul Cuffey, who happened to be a Black man, who was initially enslaved by Quakers in Boston, but he ended up being freed by his enslavers, and he became a Quaker himself. And many of the Quakers in Boston, and you'd see this in like Philadelphia and various other places, they would provide money to Black mutual aid societies, they would create churches, they would create schools for Black children, and they would actually fight against slavery and, fight alongside Black abolitionists to, get rid of the institution. So of course you're going to find some folks like John Armfield who came from Quaker stock. But yeah, so it's give and take. It's not quite perfect. History is complicated because Francis Scott Key was willing to free Michael Shiner's children and wife, but a couple of years later he was going to sue abolitionists for providing abolitionist materials in the city. So, but I feel like I've spoken a lot. So,
Not enough.
Just end this call and then tell them where to find you. Where to get more information. You have a really nice Instagram feed. Maybe tell them to follow you on Instagram.
oh, okay. My Instagram is such I should not have put it in French. Let's see. I'm so bad at this. I'm sorry, guys. Yes, so I would like to thank everyone for joining for this talk on Franklin and Armfield. I have an Instagram page dedicated to sharing Black history. Most of the time I do on this day in Black history. I have up to a year already in the bank. I did some this January for Black History Month. I'm dedicating that to like an ode to historians. So my very first one that I put up today is on Benjamin Quarles, who is known for writing and studying Black abolitionism as well as Black military history if you're into that. You can find me on Instagram at LAGUDETAMANOIRE. I apologize for being a Francophile in advance. Yes, okay. So, yes. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you.
I don't, how do I?
Off the record, what are, say, Thanksgiving dinners